Welcome to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib, who leads Realign For Palestine, which is an Atlantic Council project that challenges entrenched narratives in Israel and Palestinian discourse. So Ahmed is an outspoken critic of Hamas who writes and speaks about Gaza's political and humanitarian affairs all the time, everywhere. And I so appreciate you taking time to speak with us today, Ahmed.
Thanks for having me. Delighted to speak to you.
So, regular listeners of the Friday Focus will note that for the month of August, I've been speaking with several different people about the disengagement, 20 years to the August 2005 disengagement. We started out with public intellectual Micah Goodman, who did a Zoom out conversation, what led up to the decision to the disengagement from former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, et cetera, et cetera. Please check that out. Last week, we had a former resident of Gush Katif, Anita Tucker, who spoke about life there as a Jewish settler and how she yearns to go back. And this week, with Ahmed's help, we're going to talk about the disengagement, what happened in Gaza with the Palestinians leading up to disengagement, and the ripple effect that disengagement had after. So all of this and more when we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib. Ahmed, again, thank you so much for joining me. And before we dive into disengagement, this weighty topic, I'd just love to hear about the Gaza that you grew up in. So where are you from?
Certainly. I grew up in Gaza City in the north, in the Yarmouk neighborhood. And so our family, my dad worked in Saudi Arabia as a physician. And so we would go back and forth. And in the mid 90s, we spent a couple of years in Gaza. And then we went back. And then in the late 90s, we moved back into Gaza permanently. I remember the tail end of the Oslo process and the Oslo years, if you will. I remember the first times the proliferation of cell phones and the Palestinian landlines and all these companies, the Palestinian airlines, the Gaza short-lived airport that I flew into twice in 99 and in 2000. I remember the Erez crossing and the industrial zone there. I remember the workers in Israel, Palestinian workers going into Israel and not just working there, but actually having very robust and close relationships with their Israeli employers, with the families they worked with the businesses, the properties. But I also then remember the Second Intifada and all that entailed of as far as the violence, as far as the instability, the rise of Hamas, the weakening of the Palestinian Authority's grip on power, and how Hamas really benefited tremendously from what Arafat thought was going to be his leverage, if you will, in pressuring Israel and the international community. And so being in Gaza City, we would visit my mom's family in Rafah. So that was that was effectively my second home. We were there virtually every weekend. And to traverse northern Gaza from the north to the south, we had to go through two primary checkpoints. That was the Netzarim checkpoint between Gaza and Nuseirat. And then we would then go through the Gush Katif one. And that was where I remember vividly having the most unpleasant memories of the presence of settlements. And what was interesting is that throughout the Second Intifada, there was an evolution to how the Gush Katif settlement, checkpoint rather, operated. It used to be that the tanks would just come out near the road or like cut off the road, and that was basically the signal for all the cars to stop. Then there was a time when there was like some kind of a mini yellow gate that would open. But unlike the West Bank in Gaza, a lot of the contact, if you will, from as far as Gush Katif and the settlements, the soldiers and the settlers were largely at a distance rather. They were not very close to the Palestinian people. And so I remember then a time when the settlers from Gush Katif would cross the main. So there is the main highway that would connect Deir al Balah with Khan Yunis, and that was the main Gush Katif checkpoint. And I remember vividly how this is the side of the evolution. Then there was like when one settler would cross, there would be like a sometimes the road would close for like an hour, and then there was a light, an actual like red light, like red, orange and green established, and then there was a bridge that was established to have the Gush Katif settlers go over the road. And then Hamas came and blew up that bridge with a suicide truck. And then that bridge was reinforced. And so even with the bridge in operation, we still had the light that would stop us at either end. And so I just and then I'll just close with one time. There was one time when we arrived there we were heading to Rafah, and it was a very festive occasion. And we spent roughly 12 hours at the checkpoint. And that was the longest. Usually it's like increments of 2, 3, 4 hours. And usually, if there's a checkpoint closure, that news would reach us well before, so that you just didn't go and sit at the checkpoint. So as a child, I remember those very, very closely. And leading up to the disengagement, I remember thinking, wow, like a Gaza future where you have more territory and no checkpoints. I mean, what could go wrong? Like, that sounds wonderful. I was very excited. And then I came to the United States. I left 1 month before the withdrawal. And on July 1st, 2005, I left the Gaza Strip as a 15-year-old exchange student to the United States to come here for 1 year, go to high school, live with a host family, experience. It was a post 9/11 initiative to bring Muslim and Arab students to the United States from different countries, live here for a year, and then go back. I attempted to go back in 2006. In June, I was in Egypt, about to cross back into Gaza. Unfortunately, Hamas abducted Gilad Shalit right as I was about to cross back. And so that began my journey into making it back to the United States, ultimately receiving asylum, and effectively not going back to Gaza for the past 20 years, even though my family all remained there at the time. My dad, he was an UNRWA doctor. He ran the Jabalia clinic for the UN agency. I have two brothers and two sisters, very Palestinian-esque in that I'm the black sheep. I'm the only one who's not in medicine, the only one who's not married, the only one who doesn't have children. But that's how I maintain my connection with Gaza, both before the disengagement with my physical presence there, and then afterwards, even as I was in the United States, through the continued presence of my family and some of the projects that I worked on.
Okay, you're still very young, by the way. So the idea of children, inshallah, is still in your future. So don't rule that out. I was 46 when I had my last child. So tfu tfu
Oh,
tfu, as we
wow.
say.
Oh, wow.
But I just want to unpack a little bit of what you said. So it sounds like to me that as a child, you were born in 1990, if I'm not mistaken, such a young one.
Yes, correct. I'm 35 years old.
So young. And your impressions as a child, of course, are through the eyes of a child. But waiting in a traffic jam, you're seeing these privileged settlers crossing the road, even one at a time, that's causing your life to be disrupted so terribly. And so, of course, as a child, you think, all right, they're leaving. The traffic will subside. We'll be able to get from point A to Z very easily. And just to remind our listeners, of course, that Gush Katif is closer to Rafah on the border with Egypt and not in the north, closer to Gaza City. So it would have been a pretty quick car ride if you were able to travel directly there. I assume after all the checkpoints came out, it was probably about what, 40 minutes or something like that for your family if they were able to travel. Is that right?
But yes, and even like 30 actually. There was after the Qataris did a project to the Salah Din corridor and the beach corridor, taking Gaza from the north all the way to the south. If there was like no traffic and no Hamas would later do their own mini version of checkpoints, at times, not always. It would be like a 30-minute drive, which is like record time for Gaza standards.
For sure. So let's turn to the rise of Hamas, which Hamas is, its origins are in the Gaza Strip. So it's not as if it was a major surprise that it was able to take control of it. But tell us a little bit. Let's roll it back a little farther before your birth, even, and talk to us a little bit about the rise of Hamas and how Israel actually had a bit of a role in strengthening the religious fundamentalist group as it was starting to take root.
Certainly. So to really just summarize it and shorten it and make it quick and digestible, Hamas's roots go back to the Muslim Brotherhood's ideology. It's an offshoot. It started in the Muslim Brotherhood experienced a renaissance in Egypt after the Yom Kippur War, after the peace treaty, after Sadat, unlike Gamal Abdel Nasser, allowed the Muslim Brotherhood a lot more latitude to operate and exist, if you will. He thought this is a strategy of containment. And as part of that, some of these guys would spread their ideology in different parts of the Middle East, including, but not limited to, the Gaza Strip. Ahmed Yassin and a small number, this was the spiritual founder of Hamas, the Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the gentleman who was in a wheelchair with an old gray beard, who was assassinated in 2004. In the 70s, he was part of the Mujamma al-Islami, the Islamic complex that started as a kind of like religious services, some limited low effort social services, community engagement, etc. And at the time, Gaza was under the custodian or under the direct military occupation, which had a civilian arm. There was a military governor, and Ahmed Yassin referred to him as Abu Sabri. But basically, the governor allowed Hamas latitude to exist in Gaza, and there was actually a small budget that existed for social services and engagement, and some of that went to the founding of Hamas in the late 70s. In the early 80s, the group's activities took on more of an expansionist role in different sectors in in the Gaza Strip, and that's when I think there was a indirect interest in seeing Hamas become a gradual counterweight to some of the more secular elements of the Palestinian National Project. This was at a time when the PLO was in its height, if you will. They were in Lebanon. There was the Lebanon War and the Lebanese Civil War. The PLO was also enjoying mass global recognition. Some elements of the PLO were also actually, believe it or not, starting to moderate and say, well, because the PLO is an umbrella organization. And so some of them were like, well, maybe we need to engage in a political struggle. And actually Abu Mazen, the current Mahmoud Abbas, was part of that early pragmatic wing. And so fast forward to, okay, Israel let Hamas operate in Gaza and grow and operate and expand. And the group's first victims of its extremism were actual Palestinians. It was Palestinian women who were dressed immodestly. You got to remember, Gaza and Palestinian society were historically very secular. I mean, I come from a very religious, devout Muslim family to this day. Everybody's hijabi, everybody's very, very devout and conservative. But like, there are pictures of my family members, my aunts, my mom, my grand, like they're in like skirts and long hair, and this is in Gaza in the 70s and early 80s. And Hamas Islamized the society. And so they started aggressively going after women to Islamize the society. When the Intifada launched in 87, and they formally launched themselves as part of that intifada action and decided like we are now going to become an actual political resistance jihadist organization, then I think there was an effort to try to suppress them, to try to control them, to try to like tame them down. But by then it was too late because these guys they benefited from the networks they established. They were able to hide among the population. I mean, their ability to infuse themselves into the population and to weave in and out of civilian infrastructure, of hospitals and schools, and like that goes back decades because that's literally part of how they were founded. And so they were very difficult for Shabak and the Shin Bet services to always root out. Then the second group of victims for Hamas, after the first group of which was women, and going after bars and going after those who engage in vice, was suspected collaborators. And that's what Sinwar was actually in Israeli prison for. It was not for killing Israelis, it was for killing Palestinians. And so, fast forward to the 90s when Hamas really came to prominence with their suicide bombings. And some of those initially began as a response to the massacre by Barak Goldstein, but it was much more about opposition to the idea of two states, opposition to giving up on 78% of historic Palestine, opposition to the idea that there will be a secular Palestinian state that lives side by side with the quote unquote Zionist entity. And so that I think is where their breakout moment took place. And they unfortunately, alongside with far right elements in Israel at the time, including the current leader, the current prime minister, were inciting in their respective communities against their leaders, the leadership, against pragmatism, against the prospect of compromise. And I've always said it, and I've always learned it from my family members. I was raised in a very diversely independent household. I was always My dad's value system was all listen to everybody, don't singularly align with a single person. In other words, he always invited me to be like a sponge to learn from everybody, but he never had any interest in being part of the PA or Hamas or some of the other groups. Whereas many Palestinians, as a matter of professional needs, as a matter of salaries, as a matter of just survival, as a matter of social dynamics, they feel the need to have to belong. So, like, I remember the story of the sex scandal or the affair scandal that the prime minister, then not prime minister, Netanyahu had during his election season against Shimon Peres, and how after Hamas's series of suicide bombings in the 90s, that massive gap was closed by the fact that he benefited from Hamas's criminality and terrorism and extremism. And it was then that like the symbiotic relationship, and this is not moral equivalency, but it was then that the symbiotic relationship between the two sides, if you will, within our two respective peoples or societies became evident. And you fast forward to post the disengagement, this became incredibly apparent in how Hamas became an asset, in the sense that it severed ties with the West Bank. It kicked out the Palestinian Authority. When I applied for and interviewed for political asylum. The very day of my political asylum interview was June 14th, 2007, which is the very day that Hamas violently took over the Gaza Strip. I was 17 at the time, and I was part of the first wave of Palestinians to get asylum in the United States because of Hamas's control. And so that really was the beginning of the end of a unified Palestinian national project in pursuit of the two-state solution. And we know that that unfortunately served large elements of the far right in Israel, of the nefarious right, and some, unfortunately, within the security establishment who a small number. The whole, I mean, and my assessment is most of the security guys tended to be much more pragmatic, but some of them thought that actually this we don't have to go in there and deal with the Palestine. Like let them do each other. Like let them take care of each other, if you will. And so I think while I am a believer in Palestinian agency, I'm a believer in accountability, and I want there to be an assessment and a historical review of our leadership's failures, of our cultural challenges and problems, of where things went wrong, especially when it comes to the disengagement and how it was a missed opportunity, how there were so many possibilities. I very much so I'm of the view that Hamas would not be what it is or who it is or where it's at without direct and indirect political policy and political interference and guidance from behind, if you will, by the successive governments of Benjamin Netanyahu.
Okay, it was, of course, the government of Sharon that conducted the disengagement, which is the overarching topic of our conversation today. And it was only after the disengagement in 2006 that Hamas officially rose to power, right? So I want to talk a little bit about a missed opportunity in the very nature of the unilateral pullout from Gaza, because behind the scenes, we know this through historians and through different documents. I spoke with Professor Eli Podeh about this a couple months ago. Behind the scenes, there was a lot of cooperation going on between Israel and the US, of course, Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And Sharon just did not want to give any credit to the Palestinian Authority, not to legitimize them. And I just wonder if you look back, you, Ahmed, if you look back at this particular moment, we're talking about from 2003 until 2005, and then, of course, the formal rise of Hamas in 2006, had the Palestinian Authority, with all of its baggage, with Yasser Arafat, all of the craziness and corruption that was happening there, had it been given the credit that it actually did deserve to complete the disengagement, do you think we would have seen a different movie play out in this pressure cooker that became Gaza?
Well, precisely, and to be clear, like speaking about Netanyahu is not in any way to absolve then Prime Minister Sharon of the mistakes, the clear mistakes that were part of this what could have been an opportunity. So to your point, unfortunately, the way that the withdrawal was done unilaterally and not engaging the Palestinian Authority as part of this process, it did two things. It gave, number one, it gave credence to the idea that this was largely an effort to stop and block the establishment of a Palestinian state, and that this was about focusing on the West Bank, Judea and Samaria is the prize, and that's really where things are at. Gaza is just a distraction, and it's a quagmire. So it kind of defanged the narrative, if you will, for a lot of people that Israel did this in pursuit of peace, that Israel did this in pursuit of calm, stability. This was a goodwill gesture, etc. But more critically and more importantly, because the rise of Hamas in Gaza, and I remember this very vividly, very like in excess detail. Hamas was able to act as if the withdrawal was due to its armed resistance campaigns against the settlements, against Gush Katif. Remember that bridge that I told you they blew up? At the time, I remember they used some insane amount of TNT that was like unprecedented for Gaza's. Like they drove a truck underneath the bridge and it was just this massive thing. They killed an Israeli nuclear scientist. They infiltrated tunnel warfare was perfected in Gaza during the Intifada from like 2001 to like 2004, if you will. Kfar Darum, the Mirage, and all these other settlements in the south. So sadly, instead of weakening Hamas's narrative and saying that political process, negotiations, and engagement, and two states, and nonviolence, and diplomacy are what got us here, it inadvertently, or maybe deliberately, who knows, caused Hamas to actually be able to say, you see, we did this. Like, and then subsequently, it allowed Hamas to sell the mirage of, this is why, as soon as the Israelis leave, we're not going to build stuff where the settlements were. No, 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 no. We're going to put training camps. We're going to double down on armed resistance. Gaza is going to become a terror base for replicating this experience in the West Bank. So I very much so do believe that between Sharon and later on with Netanyahu, and again, this is not absolving Palestinians of their agency and responsibility, but nevertheless, everybody knows there is a power imbalance between the two sides. And I think Sharon and Netanyahu had a role in preventing the withdrawal of settlements from becoming an opportunity to showcase what an occupation-free West Bank could look like, and a way to empower moderates in the Palestinian society. To inadvertently, it actually empowered Hamas and the extremists.
And we read about in reports, from the United Nations, the report in November, December of 2005, we read about bloody battles within the Gaza Strip. We're talking about Palestinian on Palestinian conflict, and, dozens were killed. All sorts of terrible things were happening because it appears, at least from reading these reports from 20 years ago, that it was a bit of a lawless state at that point. And I want to ask you, Ahmed, when was it that Iran started taking such an interest in the Gaza Strip and in Hamas in particular, of course?
Well, I would argue that based on numerous conversations, especially with current and former Palestinian Authority officials, that Iran was a fundamental component in pushing Hamas to harden its position during the 1990s against the Oslo peace process. Iran, after the Islamic Revolution, very much postured as being against Israel and leading the new wave of jihadi kind of liberation. Like it was the Muslim equivalence of liberation theology, except it was violent, and it was intense, in the sense that it was not enlightened. And so I think in the 1990s, when Hamas was able to exert pressure on the PA and carry out suicide bombings that really were, for your listeners, quote unquote, impressive from a destructive point of view, Iran was very intrigued, because it said that this is not just a talking head party, but this is a party that can facilitate things. I would argue that it was really only after the withdrawal in 2005, when the Philadelphia corridor was vacated, when the corruption both on the Egyptian side and on the Palestinian Authority side allowed for an increased and an unprecedented amount of smuggling, when kind of like that vacuum, if you will, that was just that political vacuum, and Hamas's rise to power through the elections created this idea that maybe we have a beachhead now right on Israel's doorsteps. And then I would say that for sure, when the 2006 war, the war that happened while I was stuck in Egypt, when Hamas abducted Gilad Shalit, when Hezbollah did their operation to kidnap Israeli soldiers, and then there was that 33-day war in which Israel basically failed to achieve any of its goals, in which Hezbollah was perceived as being victorious. They were able to destroy something like, or damage or attack something like 60 Merkava tanks, and they killed something like 117 soldiers and 3,000 to 4,000 rockets on Israel. This was before the Iron Dome. It was really then that the Islamic Republic of Iran and the IRGC were like, wow, we really do have Israel. We can have Israel surrounded with Hamas in the south and Hezbollah in the north. and we're going to invest substantial sums into facilitating smuggling, into giving them the know-how. So going back to just specific to a Gaza context, I think early on there was the Sudan was actually an interesting route for smuggling weapons into the Gaza Strip. Things would get would vessels would arrive to the Sudanese ports onto the Red Sea. They would traverse up through Egypt with perfecting a network of bribes and different nodes in the delivery system. And then, of course, in Sinai at the time, it was mainly run by the tribes. This was before Al Qaeda or Ansar Beit al Maqdis or Daesh or IS were operational there. The Egyptian state had very limited presence in northern Sinai. And then when the Arab Spring happened, I would say Iran tripled its investment in Hamas using stockpiles from Libya. All the man pads that you see, the man pads, those are the shoulder held, handheld, and anti-aircraft missiles that you see in Gaza. That was all coming from Libya, because the Arab Spring for Iran was going to naturally then move to the Gulf states, or so they thought. So they believed that empowering Hamas and Hezbollah and Syria and all these axis of resistance, Gaza then really became part of a broader regional geopolitical game. And so, what I'll conclude just with the thing about Iran is that despite all the smuggling, and there were times when the smuggling happened like in phases, and sometimes it was really like out in the open where just like massive amounts of things were being smuggled. Sometimes it was more clandestine, like smuggling in size and scope and scale and openness went through different phases. Despite the billions of dollars that were spent on Hamas, despite all the political support, you go around Gaza, the Strip, the north, the south, the refugee camps, you'll see the Saudi neighborhood, the Emirati neighborhood, you'll see the Kuwaiti street, the Qatari village, the Omani happiness, whatever. You'll see the Moroccan this. You'll see all of these different things built by Arabs, even those that Hamas ideologically attacks or sidelines or whatever. You will never, ever, ever, ever see a single street or hospital or building that is like Iran, like the Iranian street, the Tehran. And by the way, I'm not speaking about the Iranian people. I love the Iranian. I'm talking about the regime. You will never, ever see the Iranian village, the Iranian friendship hospital. You'll see the Indonesian friendship hospital, the Malaysian hospital, the Turkish hospital. There's like literally every nation on earth virtually has done something. Even the United States, hell, even Israel has like done things indirectly through NGOs, but never a single piece of infrastructure or civilians, anything that benefits the people of Gaza. What you will see is Meydan al-Saruq. You will see like the missile roundabout. You only saw Iranian flags and Qasem Soleimani's pictures right next to rockets and right next to like incendiary, like right next to drones, right next to like garbage that was very symbolic and public purview.
Everything you're saying is so fascinating and really explains a lot of the nuance that I think we're missing behind all of what has been going on in the past 20 odd years. I do want to ask you, however, now that Iran is somewhat on the wane, or perhaps I don't know if that's even true, but Hamas is definitely compromised. I would assume that its relationship with Iran is compromised, and it's not getting the funding that it has become accustomed to over the past, 22, 23 months, of course. Is it even possible, even practically possible, to complete this step and remove Hamas from power. Just in terms of the Gazan people, are the Gazan people ready to have a different ruler than Hamas? What is your sense of that?
Well, I think absolutely, like, the unfortunate reality, even those who once supported Hamas are in numbers and at scale that I've never seen before, reassessing and reevaluating their ideology, their belief system. And by the way, support for Hamas is like an onion. There's an ideological core, but beyond that, there's a system of patronage. Some people got jobs, some people benefited. There's Hamas the government, there's Hamas the resistance group, quote unquote, and those fighters, they get salaries, they get benefits. It's a whole network of benefits. So very few Hamas members are actually doing this purely and strictly for ideology. Ideology used to be and still is a part of what sustains them. But so I would say absolutely there's been a shift and an evolution in the population that I haven't seen before. Not just because of the consequences of October 7th, not just because of the squandering of billions of dollars and the resources and the lives for the past 18 years since Hamas took over, but also because of how Hamas has been behaving during the war itself, to the point where people think they see the aid theft, they see the disregard for civilian lives, they see how Hamas, remember what I said to you back in the 70s and 80s, like this idea of being embedded in the population and part of the social fabric. That is like a foundational element of Hamas. That is how they've evaded the IDF and the Shin Bet and the Palestinian Authority and the this and the that. Like, but now at a scale that is unprecedented, that is actually causing mass civilian casualties and suffering, but also even down to the point of like tents that are affiliated with that people suspect are like affiliated with Hamas families somehow get more aid delivered to them than tents of just like random people. Somehow they seem to have more deliveries.
Right, that's my question because it is still so much embedded. It is still so much in power. There's still so much of this cronyism. There's still so much of the favoritism. It's like a cult that you can't get out of. And I just wonder if those who are within it, who are getting the aid, who are getting the better tents or whatever it is at this point, because things are so desperate in Gaza, are they even willing to really shake off their Hamas affiliation and shake off the Hamas rulership?
So there's two tiers to that. There's the tier of, I think, confidently, I and many will tell you that if there is an alternative, this has become such, it's become so regularly repeated, it's almost become a cliche, but it really is the truth. Like, people are a product of their environment. People are a product of what they have I mean, the thing about Gaza is it's not only stuck, I mean, you have the sea on the left, you have Israel that like barely let in any Gazans. I mean, we're talking a few thousands over the last 2 decades. You have Egypt that has been very restrictive in who it let in, even well before October 7th, well before all the troubles. You have a desert in Egypt, which is mainly what Gazans get in and out through. It's not like the West Bank where people get out to and within like an hour or they're in Jordan. Like you spend like 7 hours or 8 hours just to get to Cairo because you have to traverse this like massive desert. Gaza's society, the makeup of the society itself is very, it's a challenge like it's at the heart of why it is vulnerable to isolate. And by the way, people are educated. There are so many intelligent, highly accomplished people, but you have 2/3 who are displaced refugees from 48, and then you have one third who are natives. The displaced the 2/3 historically they exclusively got access to UNRWA medical, educational, and food services. and the natives didn't. But then the natives, they tend to be the ones with more access to property and a little bit of wealth. It's not either the Bedouins or like the clans, etc. So like the very makeup of the social layers. And so, for example, you'll find Hamas especially popular with refugees, much more than with the 2/3 refugees than with the 1/3 clans, because the refugees are treated as a people in waiting. It's like, well, you're kind of in this purgatory. Gaza's not technically your home, but the UN is taking care of you. But we're going to now do this resistance crap because somehow that's going to lead somewhere. So going back to your, so when I said there are two tiers to this, you need an alternative that promises dignity, that promises and delivers access to life, access to enlightenment, access to, you can live like the rest of the outside world. You can live like people in nearby Arab countries. You can live like those aliens we see on Instagram and TikTok in Dubai and Abu Dhabi or in Malaysia or in Turkey or in Europe. But then there's the other piece to shaking off this thing here. So, and that's a more difficult one. There's issues about no matter how much economic opportunities you give the people of Gaza, unless there's a new ethos that's injected in there that says Gaza is your home, Gaza is spiritually connected to the West Bank, but like we're not gonna be part of this like singular entity unless there's like a social re-engineering and a restructuring of the Palestinian national project, unless there isn't an end to the occupation of the West Bank, the military occupation, or unless there isn't a statehood, a sense of who are we as a people. And some of that is related to the conflict in Israel, and some of that is worked from within. What is Palestinian identity? Who are we? Like, can we be identified by what we stand for rather than by what we're against? What does it mean to be a Gazan? Is it really realistic to think of Gaza and the West Bank ever being connected? You know, like it's kind of like Texas and New York. They're part of the United States, but they're two fundamentally different pieces of land. So are we like this idea of a central government in Ramallah ruling both? Is that really realistic? Can there be a unique Gaza identity that can emerge to capitalize on the new economic and societal benefits, and having an airport and a seaport like I'm working on, having security, having Gaza, getting rid of UNRWA and the aid dependency forever, and actually saying, no, you live here. This is your home. We're going to have data centers. We're going to have pipelines coming from Saudi and from the Emirates, and Gaza being an oil terminal to send oil to Europe, and a renaissance, and Gaza being like this cosmopolitan place where different identities coming in there, because every people in Gaza have a fundamentally different view than people in Khan Yunis or in Rafah in the south. The regionalism and the like, everybody's in their own little cocoon. So that's what it takes to try to break the grip of a cult like Hamas that has re-engineered the society around its Islamist resistance garbage. Now, again, I want to just conclude by saying my concern is that there have been different versions of economic peace that Netanyahu and others in Israel have promoted. And I know Palestinians in the West Bank who are actual millionaires, and some of them are incredibly radical and they support Hamas. And they're not violent people themselves. They'll, but like they're like, I don't want to deal with Israelis. I don't want to deal with all this talk. Like they find it very offensive that I'm talking to you right now. That I go on Israeli TV all the time. They literally criminalize that, and they have put out fatwas against me. So my point is, unless the gains are followed up by achievements in the sense of belonging, statehood, people going from one area to another without crazy settlers, without a bunch of 18 and 19-year-old IDF soldiers harassing them, people being able to have freedom of movement, and people just being able to have a sense of identity. I'm Palestinian, here's my passport, boom. I think economic peace alone is going to plateau, and you're still going to have, if it's not Hamas, it's still going to be a different form of rejectionism that is problematic, it gets us nowhere. And to be clear, I think while many Palestinians are resentful, and it's very easy from the outside looking in to be like, oh, they don't want peace and they'll never accept Israel, blah blah blah. The reality is, if you actually offer a viable pathway towards stability, towards like prosperity, towards just a sense of self-determination, I will promise you with all my heart that the majority of Palestinians will very quickly adapt and change their outview, their overview of the whole conflict, to just see like they need to see the benefits of, we can live side by side with Israel if it means we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's like waiting for Palestinians to all accept Israel in a certain way before offering them that pathway, I think is maybe an inaccurate way of looking at it. And I feel the same about Gaza, but I feel confident nevertheless that yes, there are still people in Gaza who support Hamas, but the majority do not support Hamas. The majority do not want Hamas to rule. The majority do not want this type of quote unquote resistance or squandering of lives and squandering of resources. And the majority, in the context of the disengagement, look back at the last 20 years with immense sorrow and sadness and resentment, and wondering what could have been, no matter what the wishes of Ariel Sharon and Benjamin Netanyahu may have been. They asked the question, what could we have done differently that could have actually capitalized on this as an opportunity? This was a thread that we had, that we could have grabbed on and done something with. And unfortunately, I'll close with this. There are hordes of Western academics, journalists, pro-Palestine, the pro-Palestine industrial complex are incredibly detrimental in that they have failed to really register pretty much any of the aforementioned. All they provide is a just they're I mean, and I'm not trying to generalize here. I'm speaking in generalizing terms. Obviously, there are large pockets of people who may see things differently, whatever. But I'm gonna generalize just briefly for the sake of argument. I would say the overall sentiment is that this was all Israel's fault. Hamas is just an organic expression of resistance. The disengagement was a fraud that could have that was never meant to work. Israel made sure that the disengagement never worked by immediately, they'll say, imposing a blockade on Gaza without mentioning the idea of Hamas somehow being a part of the picture. October 7th was an inevitability. The Palestinians could have done nothing differently. And so when those sentiments are repeated over and over and over, a battered, weak, tired, exhausted, beaten population in Gaza is going to listen to that, and they're going to run with it. So they're getting reinforcement from Hamas from within. They're getting reinforcement from without, from the outside world. And so, yeah, people are a product of their environment. And no matter how many pragmatic voices or moderate voices or whatever, like myself or many others, I'm far from alone. There are many others come along and try to say our thing. I mean, go through my Twitter sometimes and go through my social media commentary sometimes and see how I am attacked and vilified, and and I need the guillotine and the death threats and die. Like I am worse than Netanyahu to some, because they're like, a Palestinian who quote unquote sells out his people is worse than a Zionist Israeli Jewish person, blah blah blah. Even though I'm only doing this precisely because, like many Palestinians, we see the disaster that our people are experiencing. And so that's why I do these conversations, especially with Israelis, because I think there's such a misunderstanding of Palestinian society, and everybody generalizes, and everybody jumps at the opportunity to paint all Palestinians in a singular brush without really understanding the nuances of our people.
Ahmed, you have brought so much nuance, and I've taken up way too much of your time. And I do appreciate how you brought it back to the disengagement and how many, such as yourself, view it as a missed opportunity, the gift that could have gone in a different direction entirely. But of course, that's not what happened. And we are here to discuss what did happen. And so I do appreciate giving us a little bit of a glimpse into the inside of Gaza before, during, and after the disengagement, and perhaps a brighter future that could actually come out if presented with a realistic, practical opportunity for change. So I so appreciate all of your time, Ahmed.
Thank you so much for talking to me. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.